you may hear, for example, that PTSD is actually extremely adaptive in a war zone. And what does that mean? That sounds very facetious. Well, it's just that if I have, and let's just say PTSD for sake of, active inference people is something like hyper precision over the likelihood of sensory data, or hyper precision over sensory prediction errors you can have if you want to do in predictive processing language. Why would that be adaptive in a war zone? Well, it's really good idea to be super aware of what's going on around me if bullets are flying around my head, right? So given an environment, there are certain ways of being which are going to be more adaptive. The problem is that we obviously exist in numerous environments over the course of our lifetime, which makes the real problem here is the fixity of the priors that we take towards the situations. And this, I think, is fleshed out in the actual psychopathological literature with PTSD, right? It's not that it was really maladaptive in the war zone. It's when they come home and then they think the threat is still live. That is the problem, because you have a prior action policy in place to set really high precision on the sensory data when you're in a suburban environment where things are pretty calm, and you can also bank on your priors, right? I mean, the point of having really, what happens if you have really high precision on your sensory data is that you start mistrusting your own prior expectations more. There's this kind of trade-off. And again, that works in a very volatile environment like a war zone, because things change really quickly. But if I live in, a suburban town, then, well, things are more likely to remain the same over time, but I'm bringing that same prior that I had in the war zone that things are going to change. So I think you can I think the sort of litmus test for this is valence, or kind of what Mark might call sort of well-being, which is that we intrinsically bodily feel how well we're doing in a given context, in a given eco niche. But there is no one way of being. It's just that obviously something like PTSD and generalized anxiety disorder and OCD are extremely maladaptive in modern cultures. But again, I wouldn't want to be particularly languid and chilled out in a war zone. I mean, you probably are going to be more adaptive if you are a little bit more alert. So again, this is not downplaying mental health disorders. I would never do such a thing. I mean, having suffered with one myself, the point being here is that if you just get right down to the nitty-gritty of the Bayesian mechanics, it's all optimal Bayesian design from the respect of the priors that you bring into the situation. It's just maybe the situation you're in is fundamentally incompatible with those priors, and there might be some dopaminergic problem where you can't modulate the precision over those priors, and so they get stuck.
But
again, this in many ways, this actually gives the last thing I'll say is this gives, in many ways, it sounds like I'm underplaying mental health disorders. I'm saying that kind of they're all sort of optimal in some strange Bayesian sense. In many ways, this offers a far more humanistic approach to a mental health disorder, which is that you're not wrong or crazy or bad. Rather, there is just something literally, structurally, wrong, maladaptive. I wouldn't even use the word wrong, maladaptive given your eco niche. So no one's bad, no one's worse, of course, given these cultural constraints, things are better, there are ways to be better than you are, given those cultural constraints. But in terms of the actual underlying mechanics, we can be a lot kinder and compassionate and just say, okay, we just need to work on making you a little bit more in a coherent and coupled relationship with your environment. That's really what it comes down to.
That makes perfect sense, because if I understand you correctly, you need to look at the higher level dynamics of the predictive processing system and that's relative to that agent's environment.
Right.
And so in a way, you could say it's something like the mathematics at the bottom level, and therefore you could say you don't need to propose that neurons are doing things incorrectly. I mean, neurons are firing how they're sort of designed to fire. Yeah. They do what they do. So you're going to have to go some high level. And so that kind of makes sense of why and how the mathematics of active inference just kind of works as it does.
Right.
But that doesn't mean, in fact, as you kind of allude to there, it can actually give us a framework for trying to understand in a more systematic and even compassionate way how that system, which is designed to go right, kind of goes wrong, depending on the environment, depending on how we've set priors and whatnot.
Exactly. I mean, one has to remember that active inference it's all about the coupled agent arena relationship. What what the free energy principle says is that the internal states of an agent, an organism, a thing can look as if they are conducting Bayesian beliefs over external states, over its environment. We are never not coupled in some sense to our environment, whether that's our culture, our ecosystem, or whether it's just the room that we're in. There's always a coupled relationship going, and this has been known forever. I mean, this really came out obviously in the 90s with enactivism and autopoiesis and sense making and the work of people like Evan Thompson and Francisco Varela and others. But the point being that everything is about that relationship. It really is the case that no man is an island. And so, or no woman is an island. Well, no one is an island, but I was quoting John Donne. John Donne was probably sexist. And yeah, I mean, the principal point here being is that, there is. I'm very skeptical of the idea that this actually comes back to what R.D. Laing was saying in the 60s in psychiatry, which was that we used to just lock people up in madhouses and say that they were done forever. But when you start realizing that there's some underlying truth ground to what people used to call madness, hysteria, well, then you start saying, well, it's true for them, right? An anxiety is really fucking true for the person who's anxious. So rather than saying there's something wrong with them, let's try and, as you say, get into the underlying mechanics and work from there. But again, this is really not to downplay this stuff, because again, the valence is really guiding you here. And this is a point that Mark makes very explicitly, Mark and Julian Kiverstein and others, which is that Mark's got this really nice paper out where he shows that well-being in many ways can be correlated with how well tuned you are to your what he calls aerodynamics, what him and Julian and Sander van der Kroijs called aerodynamics, which is the rate at which you're minimizing prediction error. And if you're really tuned into that, because the argument goes that if you are reducing prediction error at a faster rate than you expected, that's positive valence. You'll have this sense of doing well. If it's worse than you expected, you have this sense of things going badly. The more tapped in you can be to that, the more attentive you are to that, the more you can actually change your policies so that you start seeking out minima that give you better than expected prediction error minimization rates. So this all loops around to say that really the take-home message from a well-being front is you have an embodied sense of how you're doing. And if Mark is right, which I kind of think he is, you have to use that as a guide. You want to use that as a tool. But again, this isn't not something that's, you'll know what it's like. You go home after a day and it might not be something propositional, but it's just a bodily, that was a good day, that was a bad day.